So good morning, IMS Daily Dharma, Monday morning friends. My name is Tara, and this morning I want to share with you a little bit about moving from a place of excluding some uncomfortable experience or unpleasant experience that we might be encountering in our practice towards an approach of more openness and intimacy with that experience. So building our capacity to be with some things that may arise in our experience that are not so pleasant and that we sometimes get caught up in patterns of resistance to. So not excluding as a part of our mindfulness. And I want to share with you a practice that I call, that's helpful for me, that I call practicing with the last arrow. And so in our mindfulness practice, whether it's our formal sitting practice or any practice we might be doing as we're going about our daily activities, you might have noticed that there are some unpleasant, perhaps, states of the body or the mind, emotions or mind states that we just have an habitual tendency to resist opening to in our mindfulness, to resist kind of holding in mindfulness. And instead, there's just a pattern of disliking of that. And the Buddha said in a kind of a famous sutta called the Arrow Sutta that this resistance to unpleasant experience is really what creates our suffering. It is, in a way, we can pinpoint it as the mechanism of much of our suffering experience. So, the Buddha described our inevitable experience of unpleasant things, which we don't control, whether they be emotions or physical sensations. That's like a first arrow. And then if we are lamenting or disliking that experience is present, then it's like shooting ourselves with the second arrow. So this practice of opening to our capacity to be intimate and aware of a little bit more and more with patience and care, because it takes resources and resilience to cultivate more of this capacity to be with unpleasant experience. It's really a way of disentangling our habits of suffering. So actually, in my experience, there's oftentimes many, many arrows. Beyond the second arrow, it feels like sometimes there's 20, maybe more. So there may be some awareness there of a chain of resistance or disliking of what's coming up. So for example, for me, I can give an example. I may be standing in line and the thought, at first I see I'm not at the front of the line. And then there's a habit in my mind to then experience some impatience. And then there may be, 20 more arrows of resistance or disliking the unpleasantness of the sight and the thought and the reaction of impatience. So there may be judging the impatience. And then there may be some tension that comes up in my neck or my shoulders. And then that actually is an unpleasant physical sensation. So inevitably it can create a whole chain, and there can even be a reaction of irritability where I might actually say something impatient or do something impatient and more happens. So we can get somewhat lost in this and unsure of how to practice with mindfulness when there's been some recognition of unpleasantness, but not the acceptance and allowance of that unpleasantness that's necessary for a real encounter with mindfulness of the unpleasant without the reactivity, without the pushing away. So I like to invite, for myself, I practice with turning towards the second arrow. The last arrow, actually. The last arrow. So in what I was describing, it would be, okay, the whole experience of impatience, etc., the difficult body sensations. The last thing that happened for me, for example, would be irritability. And so I just turn with interest with mindfulness to what does that feel like in the body? And what does that feel like in the mind? And when I say interest, that's really what I mean. It's as simple as that. What's the manifestation of that experience in my body? And what is the tone or texture of that in the mind? Is there some contraction in the mind? Is the mind rushing? How does the heart feel? So when I say the mind, I mean the mind heart, this whole cognitive sense store that we have of thoughts and emotions. So just turning towards that. As my teacher Howie Cohn used to say, the way out is through. So when we experience, again, either in our formal practice or our daily practice, we can cultivate slowly the capacity to be with the second arrow or the 20th arrow a little bit more and realize the relief that actually happens when mindfulness is brought to bear on that chain, that set of conditions that, as I had described, of pushing away and resisting at our experience. And instead of excluding from our practice those kinds of difficulties, the patterns and the habits, we can start to integrate more and more our practice of holding those with an accepting, allowing, not excluding approach, and an interest that really allows us to be here in the present moment, despite the unpleasantness of that situation. So instead of maybe 20 arrows, there starts to be only 19 or 18. And it really helps in my experience to cut through some of the confusion about how to practice, to really look at that, what's happening right now, what's the last arrow, the last difficult experience. So now just inviting you to join with me in some mindfulness practice. Inviting you to close the eyes if that's comfortable. And opening to that balance of alertness and relaxation that really supports the balance of alertness and relaxation of the mind. So having the body just invite in rest, an alert awareness. If there are any strong tensions you notice in the body, just letting them go to the extent possible. And if you have an anchor for your mindfulness practice, such as the breath or the sensations of the hands touching or the feet touching floor, the posture, just inviting you to go ahead and open to awareness of the anchor. And if the mind wanders from your mindfulness practice and mindfulness arises again, I'd also invite you, instead of trying to turn the attention back immediately to an anchor, to just allow the mindfulness to arrest with what it's arisen in the midst of. And that experience might be pleasant thoughts, might be a fantasy, or it might be a pleasant sound or physical sensation. Just noticing. Just noticing what's there with interest, What does that feel like in the body and in the mind? And when that experience is not pulling the attention so strongly, just gently directing it back to the anchor. But you may notice that when mindfulness arises after it's wandered off for a while, that what the experience is that comes up, that's there, is unpleasant. Maybe an uncomfortable emotion or a body sensation. There may be a jumble of thoughts and emotions. And so I would just suggest or invite for you to rest with that unpleasant experience for a little bit until it's not so strong, just as you may with the pleasant. And if there's any confusion about what to notice, to open to what's the last arrow? What's the disliking? Is there any disliking of unpleasant experience that's happening? And what does that feel like? What does it feel like in the body? Is there some tension? Is there some, even sometimes burning or energetic experiences that we might have in response to unpleasant experience? Just to open and make space and allow for that to be there. And then to notice, what does that feel like in the mind and in the heart? If there's resistance or disliking of what's happening in the present, what does that resistance or disliking feel like? Is the heart contracted? Is the mind sort of rushing? Or has ease started to open up almost, or a little bit perhaps, with the allowing of that experience, allowing, opening to being mindful of that experience? And sometimes the unpleasantness can actually increase a bit. That's okay too. So if anything is just too difficult to be with, that's perfectly normal and natural. That's something we encounter in our practice as it unfolds and matures. And so we can simply shift the attention to something neutral. We can go back to the anchor. We can rest our mindfulness in a bodily sensation like the hands touching or the feet touching the floor. But we can know too that if we have this motivation and we have the resources to really understand the mechanism of suffering and to really understand how that resistance or pushing away at unpleasant experience causes more suffering, we can actually open to that. And remembering that if there had been, thoughts, emotions, physical experiences that you kind of noticing were difficult, with the full mindfulness of accepting and allowing, including that experience, noticing what it feels like wasn't there, just practicing with the last arrow. That's in the past, what we call the past, not present and here now. So to really allow for the mindfulness to unfold with what's happening in the present moment. And in the case of resistance to unpleasant experience, that can be called the last arrow. The last arrow that we see in our experience right here, right now. And always, if we have an anchor for our practice, then whenever some other experience that has called our attention is not so strong, not pulling our attention so strongly, we simply gently turn the attention back to that anchor. And one thing is that if ever any judging arises because we, quote unquote, haven't been mindful, and mindfulness arises, we didn't control that moment when mindfulness arose, or the conditions that were set in place that, triggered the mind to wander off. If there's some judging that arises for our not being mindful, that's a last arrow. We can turn towards that and notice any tension, any unpleasantness that has come along with that judging that's in the body or in the mind and the heart. It's turning towards these patterns of pushing away at our experience that allow us to begin to disentangle those habits, freeing us and really actually empowering us over time. Thank you so much, Dharma friends, for joining me in this daily Dharma practice. Wishing you the best for your week. And please come back and join us for the daily Dharma as it unfolds this week.